So for my discovery presentation, I am doing Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. When looking at this book, it's important to take a look at the author herself, especially the number of queer individuals she may have had in her life. Mary Shelley was born Mary Wollstonecraft Goodwin. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was a famous author and women's rights activist, most known for her work A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which argued that women were not inherently inferior to men, but simply appeared so because of the limitations placed on them by society. She is often credited as being the founder of modern feminism. She died only 11 days after Mary's birth, but it is suspected that she may have been bisexual due to an extremely close relationship she had with a quote-unquote friend that she even wrote a romance novel about after her death. Her father was William Goodwin, a famous philosopher who, most relevant for this presentation, talked about the idea of free love and had relatively liberal ideas of sex for the time. Percy's husband, Percy Shelley, Mary's husband, Percy Shelley, was a famous poet, but best known for his poems Ozymandias and his book Prometheus Unbound. He was an advocate of free love, and surprisingly, considering he was married twice, he was against the institution of marriage, and he was believed to be gay due to a number of suspected romances and the analysis of his work. Looking closer at Mary Shelley, she was born in 1797, and she carried out an affair with Percy Shelley when she was 17, becoming pregnant and having her baby prematurely and losing her at the age of 18. 1 year later, in 1816, she married Percy at the age of 19, and at that same year, her friends and Percy all went to the Geneva Mountains and were snowed in. There they decided it would be a good idea to have a scary story writing contest. Mary was originally at a loss for ideas, but after one night when they discussed the meaning of life, she had a nightmare that became the basis of Frankenstein. For the next 2 years, she worked on Frankenstein until publishing it in 1818. Over the next few years, she lost 2 more children and ended up only having 1 child survive. And in 1822, Percy drowned in an accident when she was 25. She continued her literary career, though not writing any book as critically acclaimed as her debut piece. And she died in 1851 at the age of 52 from a brain tumor. It is widely believed that Mary Shelley was bisexual herself. The main component behind this theory is the fact that after the death of her husband Percy, Mary wrote a series of letters to her sister in which she described her desire for the companionship of women using sexually explicit phrases from the time. She even sought to run off with a female friend of hers, Jane Williams. Let's shift now to Frankenstein as a novel and look at Frankenstein's legacy to the modern world. Frankenstein is a renowned example of Gothic horror, and perhaps one of the, if not the most famous examples of Gothic horror. It is also credited at times as being the first science fiction novel, and Mary Shelley is often credited with creating the science fiction genre. This book, as evidenced by this PowerPoint, is still being read and taught 203 years later, and an estimated 7,000 copies were sold during Mary's life. But you can guess that that number must have grown exponentially since then. And depending on who you ask, Frankenstein has become the basis for anywhere from 31 to 121 to hundreds of films and television programs. So let's look at the story of Frankenstein. Frankenstein has many themes, such as playing God and whether humans should be able to create life, the world's movement towards science and away from religious thought, a short-lived but recent for her time theory of galvanism, which is a theory about how life works and the possibility of reanimating corpses. And it also focuses on what it means to be alive and if life is worth living. and as I'm going to argue, also has a pretty deep-seated subtext of homosexuality in it. Frankenstein is the story of Victor Frankenstein, a young noble who, after going to college, becomes obsessed with the idea of creating life and succeeds at it. Over 2 years, he is overtaken by his desire to create life. But after he does, he is horrified by the results. His monster, who we know as Frankenstein but is actually just called the monster in the book, then is shunted into the world as if a newborn, but a newborn who is fully grown and aware of his surroundings, which you can imagine how disorientating that must be. And Victor's monster must struggle with what it means to be alive and what purpose is. It's also the story of those who got in the way and got hurt because of Victor and the monster's conflicts. So let's look at some of the homosexual subtext in this book. First of all is Frankenstein's relationship with women. Victor barely ever speaks to a woman in this book, and rarely ever even describes a woman. Another thing is Victor's suspiciously close relationship with his best friend Clerval, which could be seen as an example of two male friends being portrayed as great friends rather than as lovers. And Victor chooses to create not just life, but a man. Rather than choosing to create the perfect woman, Victor chooses specifically to create his ideal man. In looking at Based off Victor's descriptions of the monster, Victor sought out to make a beautiful man, but only after he looks into the eyes of his monster does he freak out, which is an example of, could be representative of someone getting caught up in their desires, but afterwards feeling shame for what they felt. And the monster haunts Victor until the day he dies, which is very representative of how being gay and these desires never leave you. So, at the beginning, we are introduced to an Arctic explorer by the name of Robert Walton. It is through his letters to his sister that the entire story of Frankenstein is written down, as told to him by Victor. And Robert is remarkably feminized by Mary Shelley, which is very conflicting with the contemporary view of explorers at the time as being gruff and quote-unquote manly. And there's a quote that stands out especially. "I have no friend, Margaret. When I am glowing with the enthusiasm of success, there will be none to participate my joy. I desire the company of a man who could sympathize with me, whose eyes would reply to mine, 'You may deem me romantic, my dear sister, but I bitterly feel the want of a friend,' which many have interpreted as not just a want of a friend, but a want of a lover, specifically a man." So, Victor and his best friend Clerval's relationship stands out greatly. Clerval is Victor's childhood friend, lifelong friend, and overall the nicest person who's ever lived. Clerval is often shown as Victor's foil. Clerval is nice and sane, and Victor is portrayed as uncaring and progressively more insane throughout the book. But whenever he's with Clerval, Victor is brought back to sanity a little, which suggests that Clerval makes Victor better by being around, which is a trope that is usually reserved for couples. Victor describes his relationship with Clerval in remarkably intense ways, with sexual subtext throughout it. More intense than he describes any woman, even his fiancée Elizabeth. And in one scene, Clerval is depicted as nursing Victor back to health and caring for him much like a wife would be expected to do at the time. But perhaps the biggest piece of evidence is Victor's reaction to the death of Clerval. When Clerval is murdered by the monster, Victor is so in shock by it that he falls into a 2-month coma And compare this to his when he learns of Elizabeth's death, where he is naturally upset, but not nearly as upset as when he lost Clerval, which suggests that Clerval is the most important person in Victor's life. But the homosexual subtext really starts to become apparent when looking at Victor's relationship to his monster. Take this quote. "I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful, great God. His hair was a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of pearly whiteness." This suggests and this shows that Victor set out to build his ideal man, something beautiful. But he was horrified with it. At the end, the creature turned out ugly, despite being beautiful. This is firstly a reflector of how we can be caught up in our desires, but once we are out of those desires, we can be filled with shame. Victor is caught up with creating a beautiful man, but once he has completed it, he realizes what it means and is disgusted by it. And it also represents the hatred that gay men can experience from both others and often by themselves. Both Victor and the monster throughout the novel destroy each other's respective female companions. Victor almost makes a wife for the monster in order to get him to go away, but at the last minute decides against it and destroys the creature. And the monster, out of retaliation, murders Victor's fiancée, Elizabeth, on their wedding night. And this could be seen as an act of revenge, but others also see it as these two men destroying each other's female companions in order to be able to be closer to each other, eliminating the female component between them. And another thing when looking at history is that Victor sought to create life. And among the romantic works of Mary Shelley's peers, life was often equated with love, and death with loneliness. So Victor did not just seek to create life, he sought to create love. He sought to end death, therefore ending loneliness. When we look at the relationship and role of women in this book, the homosexual subtext becomes even clearer. Victor's creation, making a man, is viewed as the elimination of women's roles in reproduction. Victor, by creating this man without any use of sexual reproduction, has essentially found a way to remove women from the evolutionary process, therefore, as they put it, making women obsolete. Looking at Elizabeth paints the picture even clearer. Only after the death of Elizabeth does Victor stop running from his creation and seek it out. Elizabeth, the female role in his life, was keeping him from his desires, the monster. But once she's gone, Victor stops trying to hide from it and faces it head on. Elizabeth acts as Victor's saving grace, whose loss causes him to be devoured and ultimately destroyed by his desires. And almost every single woman dies horribly in this book. Granted, almost everybody dies horribly in this book, but it's much more prevalent in the women, which is evidence of Victor's hostile relationship with women. And I am running out of time, so I will continue in part 2.